Millions of people visit national parks every year, but some never leave. In 2011, David Paulides started a database of disappearances that occurred under mysterious circumstances. No one has ever studied the similarities, the traits, and the geographical clusters of missing people on such a grand scale until now. And because of that, he's the go-to expert on national park and strange disappearances. One of the ways that he got the word out about the missing was through Coast to Coast AM, and that's how I learned about him. At the beginning, he found so many cases of missing people that one book became two, with both filled with more than 400 cases. And he's since gone on to write several more books that take place in national parks, but also in urban areas, and he also covers disappearances that occur in the air and on the water. A review of his third book says, David Paulides has shined a light onto one of the greatest and most disturbing mysteries of our time, the simple and awful fact that people disappear, especially in our national parks, and little effort is made to find them, let alone inform the public about the danger. Even when massive searches are mounted and people are found, the events surrounding their loss and recovery are often far beyond logical explanation. David Paulides says there's a continuing trend of clusters of missing people in our national parks. The NPS, or the National Park Service, still doesn't track or document missing people inside their parks and their monuments, even though it remains a serious issue. It's important to note that David Paulides never says what he believes is responsible for the disappearances. His books provide the facts only, not what he thinks is going on. And those that follow his work, they know that there isn't any one thing that's causing the disappearances. His cases don't include victims of falls, of animal attacks, foul play, or of those that want to disappear or end their lives. And relatives often believe that kidnappings and abductions are occurring. And here's an example of one of his cases. A missing child was eventually found dead 12 miles from where he originally went missing. In between those 12 miles were two mountain ranges and several creeks. So how did he get there? There are 63 parks within the U.S. National Park System that span over 84 million acres. And David Paulides has estimated that there are over 1,600 unexplained disappearances in North America. He believes the cases are kept hush-hush because if the public knew how and where people were disappearing and how few have actually been found, that it would lower the number of people that visit our national parks. His goal isn't to scare people away from visiting parks, but he thinks that people need to be made aware, especially parents. People disappear in the wilderness all the time, but this is something different. These cases involve unusual circumstances that don't make any sense. They form clusters where you'll have 3 to 4 people missing, to as many as 20 to 30 people missing in one location. When it comes to these strange disappearances, you have 3 sides. You have the skeptics, you have people that think there's nothing weird going on, and then there are those that think it's paranormal or supernatural. Where a person falls depends on what they believe in. You have those that think it has something to do with blood harvesting or DNA purposes. There are people that think aliens or wendigos are abducting people. There are some that think it's Bigfoot related, or the government is capturing people for nefarious reasons. David Paulides has researched missing person cases that go back as far as 1752, and it was an encounter with 2 park employees that inspired his Can-Am Missing project. They knew that he had a background in law enforcement. He was a retired police officer, so they asked him to research one of the cases. They told him about the cases that were very unusual and how many of the people were never found. They said the Park Service was doing everything possible to keep a lid on the publicity surrounding the missing. He explained that non-law enforcement employees weren't privy to all of this information, but that the upper echelon law enforcement supervisors inside of the park were concerned about the numbers and the facts surrounding specific cases. They were concerned about the large number of missing people and the Park Service's lack of response. They weren't conducting follow-up investigations or even keeping track of the missing. David went on to file a Freedom of Information Act request, or FOIA, and asked the NPS for stats and documentation of missing people inside of their system, When he asked for the information, the response was not only no, but hell no. The first park he requested this information from was Yosemite. The NPS, the National Park Service, told him that if he wanted a list of missing people from Yosemite, it would cost $34,000. If he wanted the list from the entire national park system, it would cost $1.4 million. As a published author, he could claim an author's exemption to fees, but he was told that his books weren't in enough libraries to qualify for the exemption. That isn't an actual requirement. They made it up. My last job was in a library. He gathers information by interviewing families, law enforcement, and search and rescue personnel. And he also spends hours and hours tediously going through newspaper archives and submitting hundreds of FOIA requests. His research has identified 34 plus clusters of missing people in North America, and the number of clusters increases from time to time. The entire state of Pennsylvania is considered one big cluster. It had the highest number of missing children between 1934 and 1957. Then, mysteriously, after an 11-year gap in cases, they started up again. The similarities within the cases that he studies are people tend to disappear in the late afternoon. When walking with multiple people or in a line, those that go missing tend to be the first or the last in line. In 95% of cases, people disappear during or just before severe weather. There's often multiple types of bad weather going on during or after the disappearance. Also, berries are involved. Either the person was eating them or picking berries. Often, the children that go missing are with a dog at the time of their disappearance, and 98 to 99% of the time, the tracking dogs will not be able to find a scent. The dog will walk in a circle and lay down. They have no interest in tracking when they're usually excited and they can't wait to get started. Children as young as 2 or 3 years old are found a day or two later, and they're often found many miles away and over mountain ranges. The missing are often found without their clothing or their shoes, even when hypothermia and paradoxical undressing has been ruled out. The clothes are found, but not the people. Bodies are often found in places that are inaccessible, or they're found in the open or in areas that were searched as many as 50 times prior. Some other similarities are autopsies cannot determine a cause of death. The person will have a disability that affects their ability to tell what happened to them. You have cases where the person can't remember what happened, or the person is part of a growing cluster. One of the creepiest disappearances that I've ever heard of is the case of Dennis Martin. In the summer of 1969, Dennis was with his family on their annual Father's Day camping trip, and he was with his father and his grandfather, and they were in the Great Smoky Mountains, which is the most visited national park in the United States. They get about 13 million visitors a year. Dennis and his brother made friends with 2 other little boys, had the last name Martin, and they were all having fun and playing around when they planned a prank on their father and grandfather. The boys were to run into the woods, sneak up behind the adults, and then jump out and scare them. Dennis's father watched him hide behind a tree that was near the start of the Appalachian Trail, but when it was time for the boys to run out and scare the men, Dennis wasn't with them. Thinking that Dennis may have just misunderstood the timing of the prank, they waited about 3 to 5 minutes before they became concerned. When he didn't show up, his father ran for 2 miles down the trail calling Dennis's name. And right away, family members, park rangers, and hikers started looking for Dennis, but he was nowhere to be found. It rained heavily and also hailed that evening, which is another common occurrence in these cases, like I said before. A park ranger and tracker named Dwight McCarter has been extremely successful in finding hundreds of missing people, and even he was shocked by the lack of tracks. Dennis seemed to have disappeared completely. Due to the amount of rain, dogs weren't called to search for Dennis's scent because his scent was likely washed out. But if he was still there, he should have been creating new scent trails for the dogs to track. About an hour after Dennis went missing, Harold Key and his family were walking up a valley nearby when they heard what he described as an enormous, sickening scream. His son told his dad to look up there. I see a bear on the side of the hill. His father looks up and says, "No, son, that's not a bear. It looks like a man, and he's hiding behind the trees from us." The man had something red slung over his shoulder that looked like it could be a small child. Dennis was wearing a red t-shirt when he disappeared. They noticed that the man walked quickly to the road and to a white vehicle, and that he drove off at a high rate of speed, throwing gravel in the air. He also appeared to be sweating heavily, and he was acting nervous. 3 days after Dennis disappeared, Key notified authorities and told them what he heard and what he saw. He wasn't able to say for sure that the man was carrying a child, but that was his impression. Before Dennis disappeared, a park ranger was attacked by what he described as a wild mountain man. There were wild or feral people living in the park at the time that Dennis went missing. And keep in mind that during this time, the Key family wasn't aware that a child was even missing. The man on the hill would be described by others in a variety of ways. A second version described him as a wild man with a bearskin over his shoulder. Others described him as a large, hairy, Bigfoot-looking creature, and this is the version that I originally heard. The next day, when the Key family were at home, they picked up the newspaper, and that's when they learned of Dennis's disappearance. Harold Key said he later received 2 anonymous phone calls around the time of Dennis's disappearance that advised him to forget about what he saw in the park that day. Was it related? Nobody knows, but it was a possible lead that the FBI didn't follow, nor did they even mention it to Dennis's father. And this infuriated him when he found out, because he always believed that Dennis had been kidnapped. A major blow to the family came when searchers found a boy that was wearing a red shirt and green shorts, just like Dennis was. It wasn't Dennis, unfortunately. The boy's name was Michael Devlin, and he was in the park with his family. And Michael's family changed his t-shirt to avoid any further confusion. A psychic contacted the authorities and said that Dennis would be found in a spot near a stream by a small waterfall with white pine trees in the area. This description was too vague so that it could have applied to hundreds of spots in the area. Searchers did their best to check out every area that matched that description. On June 26, a man called into the Knoxville News Sentinel and said to tell the searchers to look in the trees and the treetops and to stop looking on the ground. Was he another supposed psychic? No one knows. That phone call just became another strange detail surrounding that case. So the official search ended on June the 29th, but Dennis's family refused to believe that he was dead. So they put up a $5,000 reward for any information that led to his safe return. The reward has never been claimed. The search for Dennis Martin was the largest in National Park Service history, and his disappearance is still a disturbing mystery. The FBI has never been able to confirm what happened to Dennis. One of the things that he points out is how quickly some of these people go missing. They are there 1 minute and they are gone the next. He's spoken of cases where people seem to melt into their clothing. It looks as though a man could be standing straight up and just melt directly into his pants. The pants would be found lying on the ground in a very neat pile. One woman stated that she was walking around in very unfamiliar territory and saw other people, but they couldn't see her. 2 men who read one of Paulides' books told him that they were walking on their family farm and realized that all sound had disappeared around them. There were no birds chirping, no wind, just complete silence. And they were sure that they were on their family property, but they couldn't identify their surroundings. They soon walked out of what they felt was a portal and back into familiar territory. In 1966, 6-year-old Larry Jeffrey disappeared while he was playing with his 2 brothers. A massive 16-day search began with as many as 1,000 men participating. The sheriff at the time said, "We walked shoulder to shoulder, but couldn't find him." He said there are no large predators per se, so we can't worry about mammals taking him. He was in a fairly remote area where there is no vehicular access, so there was no car abduction. The boy just walked into oblivion. When David Paulides was researching the Stacy Arras case, he submitted 2 FOIA requests. Both were denied, and he was bluntly told that he would never get this case. 14-year-old Stacy Arras was from Saratoga, California. She, along with her father and several others, visited Yosemite on July 17th in 1981. They were all horseback riding, and after a few hours, they stopped at some cabins at Sunrise High Sierra Camp and tied up their horses. She and her father shared a cabin, and after freshening up, she left with her camera because she wanted to take some pictures of the lake. She asked her father if he wanted to go, but he said no. And instead, an older gentleman that was with their group, his name was Gerald Stewart, went along with her. But after a little while, he felt tired and he needed to sit down. They were on a hill and they could see Stacy walk towards the lake and behind a couple of trees until she eventually disappeared from sight. When she didn't return, the man became worried and he notified the others. And they found Stacy's camera lens a little ways into the woods, but no other clues were found. The National Guard and local volunteers searched the area, but they never found a trace of her. Because Stacy wore braces, if her skeleton is ever found, it'll be easier to identify for that very reason. It's likely she was abducted because there weren't any signs of an animal attack or her camera. Her parents died without ever knowing what happened.